at Mount St. Mary's College, University in Maryland, where he was the John L. Morrison Professor of International Studies and a department chair in political science. In 1991, he began a second career working for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency for 15 years, where he served several roles. Most recently, before his retirement in 2006, he was a senior intelligence service officer and director of the Political Islam Strategy Analysis Program in the Directorate of Intelligence at the CIA. He has traveled extensively in the Middle East and the Muslim world, lectured widely both in the United States and overseas, and written and contributed to many books and journals on political Islam and radicalization, Middle East politics, state formation, U.S. policy in the region, and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. His most recent book, A Necessary Engagement, Reinventing America's Relations with the Muslim World, was published by Princeton University Press in 2009. He's currently working on a book for Indiana University Press entitled Arab Islam and Politics, Engaging Partners for a New U.S. Foreign Policy. He comes tonight to speak to us under the title Political Islam and the Obama Administration. Why and how to engage it? Does it matter? I can think of no more important topic in international affairs for us to be talking about tonight. He's going to give a lecture of around 45 minutes, and at that point, he will open it up for your questions. So without further ado, it is a great pleasure to welcome back to St. John's after all these years, Emile Nakhleh.
Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure and a humbling experience for me to come back to St. John's after all these years. This is my first time here in 47 years, and for that, I do thank my dear friend and host, Dick Jessen, a retired Minnesota judge and a lawyer, and a classmate of mine during those years at St. John's. He and his lovely wife, Pat, have hosted us, and indeed, Arm Twisted, Matt Lindstrom, to invite me to give a talk here. I have truly enjoyed my experience these 2 days. I visited a number of classes, and I tried to kind of imagine myself after all these years sitting in the same class as a freshman at St. John's. I remember the day I arrived here by bus from Minneapolis, and one priest waited for me at the bus, and we became close friends, and he became a great mentor of mine. His name was Father Godfrey Dickman, and I learned a lot from him. But I'm also humbled and gratified and very pleased to see here in the audience a professor of mine at St. John's during that time, Joe Ferry. I did not truly expect to see my professors here. When I was here, I had the pleasure of having courses from Joe Ferry and from Ed Henry. Professor Henry taught me political theory, and how to translate Plato's Republic into real politics by example. So he ran for mayor of St. Cloud, which he directed ably. So when I was teaching at Mount St. Mary's in the small, great town of Emmitsburg in the great state of Maryland, I thought of Ed Henry, and I decided to run for public office. And here I was, you know, if you live in a small town, if your grandparents don't come from that town, you are still an outsider. Well, I decided to the elders of the town as if I would run for office. So two of us were running actually 6 of us were running for one position on the city council. And on election day in the evening, we turned to WTHU country music station in Thurmont, Maryland. This is the station that Jimmy Carter used to listen to when he came to Camp David, nearby where we lived. And they said, and now we have the election results from Emmitsburg. And the winner is, and they stopped. I told my wife, that's me, they don't know how to pronounce my name. And the entire town of Emmitsburg never knew how to pronounce my name, so they called me either Prof or Doc in the town. And so when the city policeman came to announce the results, he came and he said, Prof, you are elected. So then I became the city commissioner, and from there I became the chairman of the city board, which is equivalent to a burgess or a mayor of the town. And I remember my days in here when I started at Mount St. Mary, at St. John's University. I was on a full scholarship, which was fantastic. So I came from the hills of Galilee to the lakes of Minnesota. That first year, I, of course, froze my head off. I did not even have an overcoat. And so I wanted a job, for a part-time job, to just spending money. So I went to the bursar, Father Gordon at the time. I said, I wanted a job. He said, what do you need a job for? You have a full scholarship. I said, I need to go to the bars. I need to drink some 3-2 beer on Sundays. I need to have some money with me. So he said, okay, he will go down to the liturgical press. And at that time, Mr. O'Dwyer, the director, I went down there. He said, oh, you want a job? I said, yep. He said, yeah, I have an opening for you. I said, what's that? He said, janitor. I said, I take it. I did not know what janitor meant, so I went to my room, I looked it up in the dictionary. And, but it was a great experience, and I always remember the liberal arts, strong liberal arts education that I acquired at St. John's University. As the introduction stated, I went to, from teaching, went to government, made the migration from academia to CIA, which was a fantastic experience, really. And I started at a certain high level, which gave me the freedom to speak truth to power. Was very important experience at the agency and was a very enriching experience. What I want to talk to you about, and I will answer some questions about that experience as someone wanted to know about the life, a day in the life of a senior CIA officer. Now, I am not, and I was not James Bond. I did not carry fancy guns. I did not drive fancy cars. I did not chase good-looking women. And I did not drink expensive martinis. But I did do analysis. I did brief presidents and vice presidents. And we did contribute to informing our policies. Oftentimes, they did not listen to us, but that was all right. We were only one voice, and they had the right to make decisions. And so what I want to talk to you about is the subject of political Islam and how to engage political Islam. That is what I want in the agency to do, to build expertise on political Islam. And we created an office which I directed at Central Intelligence Agency. And I wanted to basically discuss with you a few issues of how to engage the Muslim world. I will take the Obama speech in Cairo in 2009 as a starting point. And I want to quote a short quote from that speech. The president said in June 2009, "I have come here to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world, one based upon mutual interest and mutual respect, and one based upon the truth that America and Islam are not exclusive and need not be in competition." The president, of course, was talking about the vast majorities of Muslims, not the radical fringe and that supports violence and supports terrorism. Now, the Cairo speech made two very important points. One, that the United States was not and is not at war with Islam, that we are at war with terrorists and we are at war with Al-Qaeda, but we are not at war with Islam. This was a point that was already made by President Bush right after 9/11. President Obama repeated that point. The second very important point in this speech was that the president said we would engage Muslim communities, not Muslim regimes. We would continue to engage Muslim regimes for national security issues, but we will engage Muslim communities in order to help them lift up their societies and hence produce better functioning societies and a hopeful future for their youth. He focused on the youth, and that's why he gave the speech at the university in Cairo rather than at a presidential palace or somewhere else. He wanted to focus on the rising generation, and to provide through tangible initiatives, programs that would create some hopeful future for these youth in Muslim countries worldwide. Now, the key assumptions in the Cairo speech are very, very important. And they are, first, that Muslims' disagreements with the United States are not driven by values of good governance, but by policies, specific policies. And that's a very key point, because if these disagreements were driven by values, then there is nothing much to talk about. There's not much to talk about. We cannot engage if there is disagreement over values of good governance. Indeed, the Pew poll and the Gallup poll and other public opinion polls have clearly shown that those disagreements are not over free speech, effective and accountable government, fair and free elections, but they were driven by very specific policy. The second point in that speech, as an assumption of that speech, is that the low standing, U.S. low standing in the Muslim world is reversible. That we used to have high standing, and in the last 10 years that standing went down, but that standing is reversible. And it is reversible because those disagreements are driven by policies rather than by values. And the third was that effective U.S. engagement must be balanced and based on mutual respect and justice and fairness. That it must be balanced and it must be a two-way street. We are not going to go and tell other societies what's good for them. We are going to work for them with them as they identify the needs in those respective societies. And the fourth is that empowering communities from below will, in the aggregate, move those societies upward. That's a major change from the previous administration, when we used to talk about exporting democracy or political reform to those countries. The speech implies clearly that democracy has to grow from within those societies and has to grow by those communities themselves with some support from the outside, but the growth of that democratization has to be indigenous. So the president talked about engaging credible indigenous organizations within and communities, civil society organizations, NGOs, and other credible organizations within those societies. And fifth, that effective and successful engagement must be done through not the traditional elites that we used to speak with. Those elites I used to describe always as Western-educated, English-speaking, Scotch-drinking Muslims. But he talked about engaging credible organizations at the basic society level. Vast majorities of Muslims today are not Western educated, are not English speaking, are not Scotch drinking. They are barely high school educated. They have not been to the West. And it is these communities that we need to engage. If these societies are going to move upward, they are going to move upward through these indigenous credible communities. Now, all of this creates major challenges, of course. Now, the key arguments I want to make here, and again, this is, I view this as a conversation, and I truly appreciate your ideas and comments and questions at the end. The first argument is that engagement, messaging, public diplomacy cannot succeed in a vacuum. That the Cairo speech and other fancy speeches, rhetoric by itself is not sufficient to engage. But engagement has going to occur through tangible projects and programs that benefit people, from clean water to modern education, to health services, to micro-investment, to entrepreneurship. That if you are going to create a hopeful future for the youth, you've got to create initiatives that are job-creating initiatives. And that's a very key in the engagement strategy. The second argument is that our government should take a more nuanced approach toward Islamic political parties. Because in many Muslim countries, we have seen the rise of Islamic political parties that are engaged in the political process now. Now, some of those parties disagree with our foreign policy. But that doesn't mean we should not talk to them. As long as they are mainstream, as long as they are tolerant, as long as they support gradual change within the system, we should be able to talk to them despite their opposition to our specific foreign policy. The third argument, unfortunately, is that the Cairo speech has all but faded a year later. And the reason it faded is that we have not been able to deliver on tangible projects to go along with the beautiful rhetoric that the speech presented in Cairo. And the fourth argument is that this engagement should be, by process and by policy, a two-way street. That is, we should engage those communities and seek their opinions about what is needed in those communities, in those societies. Some communities might need a generator to do electricity. Some might need water purification systems. Some might need healthcare services. Some might need more technology and electronics in their schools. And so different groups and different societies will identify different needs. And therefore, engagement should respond to those needs. And the fifth argument is that this engagement is a global challenge. It's no longer an American project. And what I'm saying here is that we need to engage to partner with European countries, with EU countries, NATO countries as the first level. And the second level, we need to engage and partner with a couple of modernizing Muslim countries such as Turkey and Indonesia. I mean, Turkey and Indonesia have shown very clearly that Islam and democracy can work together. They have shown very clearly that an Islamic political party in Turkey can run a modern government based on democratic principles that we accept in the West. Indonesia has the Muslim world's two largest NGOs in the world, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. Each one has over 30 million members. They have been involved in all kinds of civil society programs, civil society initiatives, NGO initiatives, from healthcare to education to agriculture. So they have had the experience to deal with these issues. And of course, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. And so we should be able then to do this partnering with those countries as we begin to partner with EU countries. And basically the sixth argument, and that engaging broader segments of Muslim societies, creating opportunities in the long run, is the only way to defeat terrorism. That radicalism and terrorism cannot be fought and defeated by hard power alone. That we have a huge array of soft power at our disposal that we can employ in order to create opportunities for other youth in other Muslim societies that ultimately will pull the rug, will delegitimize the radical paradigm. In fact, we already have good news about that. In fact, Al-Qaeda is already losing that so-called moral argument which it has presented after 9/11, the killing of innocent civilians. There has been more opposition and more rejection to Al-Qaeda and the radical paradigm in Muslim societies in the last couple of years than we've ever heard in the past. This is good news. They have not been able to recruit as much. They have not been able to draw funds, raise fundraising as much. When they recruit, they do not put their recruits in adequate training. Hence, the underwear bomber over Detroit could not even light the fuse. And that guy in Shahzad in New York could not light the fuse in his car. That means they have not been able to do sufficient training, and that's because of the pressure that we have put on. But in the long run, drying up the recruits for Al-Qaeda and the radical paradigm can only come through the utilization of soft power, and that's initiatives that create opportunities in Muslim countries. The point I want to make right away, though, I should have started with that, and that is that when we talk about the Islamic world, ladies and gentlemen, please keep in mind that there is no such a thing as one Muslim world, or one Islamic street, or one Islamic culture, or one Islamic society. There are many diverse Muslim societies, diverse Muslim cultures, diverse Muslim historical narratives, diverse Muslim languages. And why is this important? I mean, it's an important thing to understand because it's an important thing to deal with. This is important because engagement initiatives cannot be cookie-cutter approach, cannot take a cookie-cutter approach. They've got to be tailor-made for specific audiences. I mean, the Muslims of Indonesia are not the same as the Muslims of England. or the Muslims of Egypt, or the Muslims of Turkey, or the Muslims of Uzbekistan, or the Muslims of Malaysia. Well, if they are different, then we have to devise different tailor-made strategies for different audiences. I mean, I remember one time when I was briefing in the White House on this very point after 9/11, and I was telling a senior policymaker, well, about this exact briefing I was giving him, and then a week later, something happened. And so I got this question from the White House, what does the Muslim world think about this? I said, I just briefed you, there's no such a Muslim world, so what Muslim world do you want me to talk about? You want me to talk about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey? Which Muslim world you are interested in? And so it's a very important thing not only to understand that, but to devise strategies that address that reality. There is a tremendous diversity in the Muslim world. Of course, they all worship Islam, they follow Islam, but countries and cultures vary from region to region. Now, the subtitle of the piece, does engagement matter? My bottom judgment up front, yes, it does. And why it matters? Because engaging the Islamic world serves our national interest, ladies and gentlemen. It is very nice to engage, but we do not engage just because we are nice people. We do not engage because it's the right thing to do. We do not engage just because we love Muslims. We engage because we cannot ignore 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide. We are not talking about 200-300 Mormons in southeast Utah. We are talking about 1.5 billion Muslims. So if we have 1% or 0.5% that engages in violence and terrorism, what about the other 98%? What about the other 99%? Muslims live in every country, almost all over the world. In my job, I visited dozens and dozens of countries and interviewed hundreds of Muslim activists across the globe over a 15-year period. So it is very important to engage. The fact is, we already engage most Muslim countries militarily, economically, culturally, educationally, commercially, and so on. So we are involved in those countries. We are fighting 2 wars in Muslim countries. We have our troops deployed on the borders of dozens of Muslim countries. We have economic relations with many, many Muslim countries. So we are already engaged with Muslim countries. And so therefore it serves our national interest to establish a level of engagement in which they see that we are not involved in a war against them, but that we are interested in providing opportunities for those societies to lift themselves upward. Now, there are many challenges, and I want to address some of these challenges. The first challenge for engagement is that we need to establish it as a national policy. We have talked about it, but we have not developed it in practice in terms of public policy as a national policy, similar to what we did during the Cold War. The United States during the Cold War established a national policy that we need to defeat communism. That was a bipartisan policy, and which resulted in the collapse of communism. Now, this has to be a national policy where we would need to assign resources, we need to assign, to build expertise, and we need to build capacity across government. That's a very important aspect of engagement. You know, traditionally, U.S. State Department, USAID did many of these projects. Well, this is no longer sufficient. We have some of our best research on energy resources and energy sources and clean water is done by our scientists at Sandia Lab and Los Alamos Lab and other labs. Well, these labs are under the Department of Energy. So it makes sense to involve the Department of Energy. If we talk about good governance, it makes sense to bring expertise from the Department of Justice. If we talk about education, it makes sense to bring expertise from the Department of Education. If we talk about labor laws, it makes sense to bring in experts from the Department of Labor. If we talk about micro-investment and entrepreneurship, it makes sense to bring experts from the Department of Commerce. So you see, we need to build capacity across government for this engagement. And the related challenge is that if you build capacity across government, you need a strategic definer, a central entity to provide the strategic definition, the strategic parameters of this engagement. And we are arguing, and this report from the Chicago Council is arguing that the strategic definer should be the National Security Council. And the National Security Council is already beginning to take on this responsibility. However, I do not, especially for those of you who have worked in government, I do not want to underemphasize the turf issues and the competition among bureaucracies in Washington. State Department does not want to give this up, of course. Other departments don't want to give this up, of course. And so therefore, the National Security Council should be the strategic definer of this effort. Now, a related challenge, when I talk about partnering with Europe, the first challenge is that we do not have an agreed approach between us and the European countries. The European countries do not have a common approach to engagement. Some of them, like the UK, views engagement primarily as a domestic issue. In other words, they deal with their Muslim communities. Whereas for the United States, it's a global foreign policy issue rather than a domestic issue. Thirdly, related to the Europeans, they are not sure that they need to engage communities outside their boundaries, whether it's France and North Africans, England and East Asian or South Asians, Germany and Turks, the Netherlands and Indonesians or Somalis. So they have not viewed it as a global issue that goes beyond their boundaries. So these are real challenges that we need to deal with, our policymakers need to deal with if engagement is going to succeed. And the final challenge is that in many of these countries where you have autocratic, authoritarian regimes, engaging communities can be viewed by some of these regimes as a destabilizing effort. So we have to convince these regimes that engaging communities in their societies will help lift their societies upward. Now, in the long run, we are not going to raise that issue, because in the long run, they are going to begin to question those regimes, which is a good thing to do. But in the immediate future, we need to emphasize the point that local communities will benefit from this engagement. Now, I started by talking about political Islam and how to engage it and how to engage communities within political Islam. What do we mean by political Islam? When I was brought into the agency in a full-time position to establish expertise in political Islam, we tried to establish a distinction a definition which the US government has accepted since then between political Islam and Islam. That the US government, as a government, does not target a religion. That's a very important principle. That we don't care how many times a person prays, how many times you go to a mosque, how many times you go to a synagogue, how many times you go to church, how many times you go to temple. That's your business. So personal piety is not part of what the government is interested in. The government is interested in is when people begin to use religion for a political agenda, for policy. When people begin to use religion to drive policy, then that becomes of concern to the US government, lawful and unlawful. CIA concluded several years back that this is a tradition, that this is a generational issue that will be with us for years to come. Now, if the agency is going to advise policy, is going to inform policy, then it's got to have the expertise to do it. And how do you have the expertise? Well, you've got to build the expertise. You've got to assign resources, you've got to hire people, and you've got to build expertise in this area. And that's the good news. Of course, I always say, of course, the bad news is that the agency remains the only government agency and office with this type of expertise. Until this very day, it's the only agency within the US government that has that office of expertise in political Islam. And that has to expand. It is not sufficient. So political Islam then is any person, any group, any movement. Of course, that happens also in Christianity and Judaism, but we are not talking about this evening. So any person, any individual, any organization that uses their interpretation of their religion to bring about a change in the political system. Politics, economics, judicial, education, whatever the area is. So if they use their religion to bring about a change, lawful or unlawful, we need to understand that. We need to understand how do political parties function, Islamic political parties function. We need to understand which of them are going to push for Islamic law and which of them are going to push for just legislation like any other political party. We need to understand that. We need to understand how many of those parties or which parties support civil rights, women's rights, educational rights, open society, and which do not. That's very important. And if after 9/11, I can tell you stories from now till doomsday of all the war stories that I experienced, we had all kinds of questions from the White House about basic Islamic issues. Now, if you are going to answer the president's question or the vice president's questions, you better have the expertise. Otherwise, they will not come back to you with more questions. And you want them to come back to you with more questions, even though they might not like your briefings or your answers that you are giving. But they keep coming back when you have the expertise. So the agency developed that expertise. Now, what we have noticed is that in the last 30 years, there have been a tremendous growth in Muslims becoming aware of their Islamic identity. This, what we call Islamization. And the Central Intelligence Agency wanted to understand this phenomenon, wanted to study this phenomenon, wanted to analyze this phenomenon, and to see the trends, the implications for the future. What does it mean for our policy? What does it mean for our relations with Muslim countries? And we are talking about 57 Muslim majority countries and over 100 Muslim minority countries worldwide. And therefore, the United States has relations and long-term interest in those countries. How do you deal with those countries if the most influential groups in those countries tend to be Muslim. How can you deal with Egypt if you do not engage the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? How do you engage Lebanon if you don't engage Hezbollah? How do you engage Turkey if you don't engage the AKP? How do you engage Malaysia if you don't engage PAS? How do you engage Indonesia if you don't engage PKS? How do you engage Bahrain if you don't engage Al-Wifaq? And so on, country after country after country. So we have to learn which groups, which parties to engage, and how to engage, and with what specific programs to engage. Now, how do I see, and I will end on this couple of concluding thoughts. So the bottom line judgment about political Islam, I have just kind of 2-3 bottom line judgments. One is that political Islam is highly diverse and complex. So when we talk about Islam, we have to remember there is no one monolithic Islamic world. There is tremendous diversity, languages, cultures, and complexity. The second bottom line judgment is that based on our travels, interviews, and analysis, is that vast majorities of Muslims, like vast majorities of Christians, like vast majorities of Jews, like vast majorities of Hindus, do not support violence, are engaged in issues that are bread and butter issues that are of concern to their families. They have mortgages to pay, kids to educate, bills to pay. They have concerns about electricity, about water, about health, about insurance, about how to pay for a car, and so on. They're daily life issues. Vast majorities of people. They don't care about politics. They don't care about radicalism. They are interested in life, in daily life issues. And the third is that the growth of Islamization in recent years and the growth of Islam, as the Chicago Council report has stated, is part of the growth of religions worldwide. We have seen in the last 10, 15 years the growth of religions, all religions, as a driver in the policies of states and non-state units. Christianity, evangelical Christianity in Africa, Orthodox Christianity in Russia, Hinduism in India, Judaism in Israel, and Islam in the Muslim countries. The fact is, we have seen a tremendous growth of Christianity, evangelical Christianity in this country also, as a driver of policy. So this has been a growth of religions worldwide. If you go to Nigeria, you find that the evangelical church is very, very powerful. If you go to Uganda, you find that the evangelical church is very powerful, the Christian church. So you see, the growth of religions has been a phenomenon, a recent phenomenon that this country has to deal with. And the fourth point, which is the conclusion of these three, is that in order to deal with these three areas, I'm going to state the obvious, and it is proper in an academic setting. We need expertise to develop knowledge and expertise to deal with these issues. That it is not enough to get engaged in emotional debates on Fox television and others. We need to develop rational expertise that leads to rational discussion, to rational engagement, and that only comes through expertise. That comes only through deepening our knowledge of those cultures and societies. We need to know more about their histories. We need to know more about their languages. We need to know more about their societies. We need to know more about their economics. We need to know more about their education. And that is why CIA had asked me to establish that office, basically to develop that expertise through hiring people who would focus on these issues. As a parting thought, to start with, I talked about the Obama administration and relations with the Muslim world. I am today, even though Cairo has faded, having carried on more conversations with policymakers since then, I'm cautiously optimistic about future relations between the Obama administration and the Muslim world, and the wider Muslim world. The bounce from Cairo, although faded, it can be resuscitated, it can be resurrected through tangible projects that affect people's daily lives. That the time for speech is over. What is important now is real projects that touch people's lives, that give people hope for the future. When I was at Guantanamo and I talked to some detainees, some of the young detainees told me they got into jihad and into radicalism because after high school they had nothing else to do. They had no job, they had no business, they had no economics, they have no hope, they could not leave their parents, so they had nothing else to do. We've got to provide projects that generate hope for the future, for the youth of these Muslim societies. And finally, it seems to me, unless, as I alluded to earlier, unless we view engagement as a national policy, and that would transcend any one presidential term, unless we assign appropriate resources, unless we are convinced that this engagement serves our national interest, and unless we build appropriate expertise, I don't think engagement is going to get anywhere. But I'm hopeful that we are beginning on this route, and I will stop with that. Thank you very much.
Just a couple of announcements while he catches his breath and gets ready to take your questions. He's referred to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs report, Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a New Imperative for U.S. Foreign Policy. There are complimentary copies of that on a table in the back as you go out. And also his book, A Necessary Engagement. There is also a table back there where those will be sold at the end of the talk, and he will be signing those copies for those that purchase it. Just a quick plug for our continuing engagement with important issues, in this case a related issue. From this podium next Monday evening, October 4th, Robina Bhatti, a peace and justice activist from Pakistan, a winner of a 2009 Women Peacemaker of the Year award, is going to be talking on the subject of the struggle for environmental justice, peace, and women's rights in Pakistan. So that's next Monday night at 7:30 in this location, and I hope that many of you come back for that. He is now ready to take your questions. I would ask you, if you could, to repeat the questions so that that gets into the record as you answer it, and I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Sir. The question was about what advice do I give to our young participants here, audience, how to pursue their expertise and where to go. The first thing is to graduate successfully from St. John's University as good students. And I told them in the classes these days that if they want a career in the intelligence community, that the intelligence community does not hire C students. They hire much, much better students. So the first thing is to develop their liberal arts education. I said in the classes today and yesterday that the liberal arts education I learned at and I acquired at St. John's helped me in my career immensely. Now, graduating from St. John's, I strongly suggest you go on to graduate school. Pursue courses and programs of studies that involve Islamic cultures, if you want this in this avenue. Religious studies at Harvard, Chicago, and other Georgetown, and many other places. Third, try to acquire languages, what we call any one of the Muslim languages. Arabic, Farsi, Bahasa Indonesia, Urdu, Malay, whatever language that you can communicate. And finally, at this age, try to establish contacts through the internet with other young people of your age in other countries, to establish personal relationships. Last year, if you recall, the elections that was stolen in Iran, that resulted in a tremendous opposition movement. Most of that opposition movement was carried on by young people. And on Facebook and Twitter and so on. Now, I do want to tell people who are interested in a career in the intelligence community, stay away from Facebook. And then at the agency, once you are employed, we have different areas and incentives and programs to expand your expertise. Trips and visits to other countries and so on. So there are programs to enhance one's expertise and deepen one's expertise. Ma'am.
Do you think that they require kind of the support, since they may require the support of the American public, there might have to be a cultural shift or education of the public about their widely held misperceptions about the Muslim world?
Right. The question was, if we are going to establish these engagement policies, how can we basically convince the American public that this is a good thing to do, despite the fact that there's a lot of negative feelings about Islam? I think that's a very important question, because you cannot, in a democracy, pursue policies without having the public behind you. So, in a sense, the administration needs to do a lot of educating of the American public on the fact that engagement of Muslim world communities serves the national interests of the United States and the national security of the United States. That is a very key issue, and that educating the public on that is very important. The second point of educating the public is that this distinction between the fringe, radical, terrorist, extremist element and the vast majority of Muslims. That when we look around, we have anywhere between 6 to 8 million Muslims in America. They all have integrated in society. They are working in all walks of life, from space science to medicine, from academia to business, Fortune 500. So they are involved in all kinds of projects. So it's not like we have a separate Muslim problem as some European countries have. But that is very important to establish. So this educating business is important. And I just point to the last part of the president's press conference, the last long press conference, and in which he talked about Islam and engaging Islam. And that was a very important point as educating point. So the government needs to educate the public on this issue. Ma'am.
The Islam, especially with Islamization being what it is now, it is difficult for us to knock on a door if we're not accepted inside. What's the policy or what is the feeling in the Islam world about, in the Islam world in general, about us coming in, wanting to engage with them? It's difficult, for example, with my understanding is that the women have a very difficult role in the Islam world, and my understanding is that they don't want westernization of their culture. So I think that it's difficult for us to engage in that respect. They don't want it.
Thank you. The question is difficulty of engagement, and if engagement is a two-way street, what do we know about the attitude of the Muslim world toward us and towards engaging with us? Would they be willing to do that? And would they view this engagement as part of globalization and westernization, which they would reject? Is that a fair rendition of your question? Actually, public opinion polls in the last 8 to 10 years have shown that vast majorities of Muslims would be interested and willing to engage with the United States, establish relations with the United States at the societal level on the basis of mutual trust and fairness and justice, as the president, the terms that the president used in Cairo. Those terms, by the way, that speech, I don't know whether some of you have analyzed it in depth. That speech was a very important speech. A lot of time went into the phraseology in that speech. A lot of meetings, I participated in some of those meetings, what words to use in that speech. And the word communities was very, very important. Because the United States, we were accused always of engaging governments and not societies. That has been the accusation, that we have established relations with regimes and not their constituents and not their people. And what the president said, this word communities was very, very thoughtful word that was arrived at after a lot of discussion. And the president said, we need to engage communities. While we will continue to engage regimes for military and security issues, but we need to engage communities. And that was a response to the desire from communities to engage with the United States. And they do not see this as imposition of a certain globalization ideology on them. If it is a two-way street. That is, if the communities at the local level are involved in defining, identifying their needs, then they don't view this as something that is being rammed down their throat. And that's the key issue in engaging community. Sir.
In the Muslim world, do you think the United States has enough resources to do that? I mean, the United States is having a problem with healthcare here. Are they providing it to other countries? What do you think about that?
The resources are available, of course, if the policy is articulated. And secondly,
engagement, as I said, the challenge now is that it's a global response. So the partnership, I'll be going to some meetings in Berlin and Brussels next month on this very issue with the Chicago Council about the partnering with European countries and NGOs. They've had the experience. They have built capacity across government. They've had experience in dealing with the Mediterranean basin, with Africa, with East Asia, with South Asia, with Central Asia. And so they've had experience in dealing with these countries. And so the Europeans can increase and strengthen this engagement. So it's just no longer really, even though we as a country have the resources, it is no longer just an American project. That if this challenge is global, then the response must be global. And would be, as I said, the first level would be U.S. transatlantic, that is a transatlantic partnership. And the second level will be involving a couple of modernizing countries, Muslim countries, modern countries, perhaps Turkey, perhaps Indonesia, perhaps Morocco in the process. So it would have to be a collective, almost a global effort, rather than an individual American initiative. Sir, Honorable. Well, my view about, I thought this question was bound to come up, about the community center, the Muslim community center in New York, which is located about 2 blocks from Ground Zero. And what does it have to do with political Islam? Unfortunately, without getting into the emotional debate about it, unfortunately, this got caught up in domestic American politics, and both religious and political. And it's not really a political Islam issue globally. The response to it was actually very mute until very recently. There was more response to that pastor who wanted to burn the Quran down in Florida than to the Muslim Community Center in New York. But the emotionalism about that became more domestic political issue rather than a global issue. Sir, next. Thank you. Yeah. Well, you know, what do I say to someone who is against it? If someone does not want to participate in a rational argument, I'm afraid there is not much to talk to that person. But what I would say, though, is that let's focus on the program that this center is going to develop. That is, what concerns me and what is of more important to me is not really the building or where the building is does it propose, does it advance, does it advocate tolerance and moderation? If it does, then it's great wherever it's built. If it is to further the goals that, as the mayor of New York so eloquently stated, if it furthers the goals in our Constitution and the values of our society, then that's fine. It doesn't really matter where it's built. And if it's built on a little hill in northern Minnesota and advocates radicalism, it's bad. If it advocates radicalism, if it's Ground Zero, it's bad. If it advocates moderation and tolerance, it's good regardless of where it's built. I mean, the debate should be a rational debate about the program that it's supposed to advocate. I mean, on the Cordoba House Board of Trustees, there are Jews and there are Christians as well as Muslims. And in fact, many of the families have not objected to it. And for months, it went through the procedures of zoning laws and everything else, and we did not hear a word about it until Fox Television and Fox News and other radical right elements took hold of it. And then the debate became caught up in all kinds of emotional issues. So I just would stand back a bit and say, let's see, what does this advocate? What programs does it further? Does it further inter-religious discussion? Does it promote interracial discussion? Does it promote principles of tolerance and moderation? That would be great wherever it's built. Ma'am.
Speech of the UN. How is the United States to try to engage, Iran if they insist on, articulating conspiracy theories about September 11th and continue to develop nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean,
How do we engage Iran in light, the question was, in light of the despicable, no, those are my words, in light of the statements that Ahmadinejad made at the UN. The president's response to those statements, I agree with that wholeheartedly. They are despicable, offensive, and hateful statements. There is no justification, there is no reason, there is no rationale for those statements. Having said that, Iran is much bigger than Ahmadinejad. Iran is a major regional power. And in the long run, it's, I think, the height of folly on our part to think that we can talk about regional security in the Persian Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean without engaging Iran. Iran is a pivotal player in the Persian Gulf region as a country. It was so before the Islamic Republic, when we announced in the 50s and 60s that Iran was the cornerstone of Gulf security. Indeed, we wanted the Shah to be the prime defender of Gulf security. When President Nixon visited the Shah to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, he came back so enamored and he turned the faucet and ordered the Pentagon to give Iran whatever weapons they wanted. A second point to keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, the nuclear program in Iran was started by the Shah. That when the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, picked up the blueprints, those were the blueprints that the Shah developed and put on the shelf because he was kicked out. So they took him from the shelf and looked at him and said, oh, that will enhance our prestige and stature, so we want to pursue that. Now, we need to ultimately deal with Iran if we are going to talk about, so they have a regime change, and from the Shah to the Islamic Republic. But in the meantime, Iran remained and continued to be a major power in the Persian Gulf region. Iran is a diverse country, is a rich country, is a culturally vibrant country. They have a huge culture, they have history, and they have power to establish themselves as a regional player in the Persian Gulf, on the Arab side and on the South Asian side. Iran has relations with all countries in the region, and we need to take that into effect. Now, Iran's nuclear program has been also part and parcel of this emotional politics because of Ahmadinejad's other statements about the Holocaust and about things of that sort. Totally irrational statements, in that they are statements that factually have been proven wrong. That the Holocaust did occur. It doesn't matter how many times Ahmadinejad denies it, right? The Al-Qaeda itself, Bin Laden's statement on October 20, 2001 clearly stated that they trained those people for the 9/11 attack. So that's factual. So it doesn't matter how many conspiracy theories Ahmadinejad states. Now, on the nuclear program, If Iran wants to have a nuclear program, Iran in the end will have a nuclear program. It is not going to be something that threats from the outside are going to keep him from having. Assuming Iran decides to go the nuclear route. Iran has not reached that state. Iran is enriching uranium and will reach a stage, most likely, if I were going to guess, most likely I would say they would reach a point and they will stop before developing the bomb. Now, as I mentioned a book that I read recently called The Nuclear Express by Reed and Stillman. And the two takeaways you take from that book is that any power, any state that has the will, the intent, and the means and wants to go nuclear will end up going nuclear. Those who decided not to, like Brazil, South Korea, and others, they decided voluntarily not to go nuclear. Now, some countries takes them longer. India, who have to depend on their indigenous brain power. Other countries who steal and spy and buy takes them shorter time. Like Russia, China, Pakistan, Israel, and so many other countries. Now, a second takeaway is that the United States have learned to deal with whatever country that has gone nuclear. We didn't like it when India did that. We didn't like it when Pakistan did that. Well, we are dealing with them now. The question is, what will happen assuming Iran develops a nuclear weapon? It will be years before Israel loses its superiority, either in conventional weapons or in nuclear weapons. I mean, Israel will continue to have preponderance of power and favoring it for decades to come, despite the fact that, or despite the possibility that Iran might become nuclear. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I think what's important is that we need to begin to pursue a new regime, because obviously the non-proliferation regime has failed. I mean, for all intents and purposes, has failed. So we need to develop perhaps a new counter-proliferation regime where countries like Israel would come clean, would join the NPT, and would talk rationally and openly about their nuclear program. I mean, this opacity that Israel has followed, it worked for a while, it worked for many decades, but it's no longer really effective, because everybody knows that Israel is a nuclear power. So let's then move on to the next level and say, how do we get these nuclear powers and potential nuclear powers to abide by new rules under a new kind of NPT, non-proliferation treaty, where they would be held accountable for violations of that? And I think this is the strategic discussion that is now due for discussion, really, rather than whether Iran has a nuclear weapon or not, and whether all the options are on the table or not. Sir. Thank you. Of course, you all heard the question. Do I need to repeat it? Okay, very briefly is that how can we expect the Europeans to engage if they are pursuing secular policies against Islam in their own societies? How will this global effort succeed? Does that summarize the question? The challenge, one of the challenges I raised in the presentation is that there has been no consistent European approach to engagement. Having said that, there has been more active European engagement with Islamic communities, but for the most part domestically. So most of the effort that the British government has done, although part of it is overseas, most of it is domestically with British Muslim communities in their own country. And so that is the challenge between us and them. For the United States, the engagement issue is a foreign policy global issue. For many European countries, it is, a domestic issue. Part of it is foreign. Now, in recent years, more and more European NGOs have been involved in these engagement efforts. European governments have built capacity across government, which we haven't done in this country, are yet to do in this country, in this engagement effort. So these specific policies have hurt their specific relations with their own Muslim communities. And there's been debate about the hijab on Islamic media and Al Jazeera and other places, but especially radical media. But for the most mainstream, Muslim media have not really spent much time and effort on debating those secular, if you will, or anti-Islamic symbols policies in countries like Germany or like France. Sir.
The president has made commitment to follow peace process. Talk a little bit about that. How significant your view is that part of the strategy toward, and what are the dangers there given the complexity?
Right. Before the new president took office, public opinion polls in the greater Middle East and other Muslim countries, the Pew poll and the Gallup poll and others, clearly showed that the Arab-Israeli conflict was one of the top policies that they wanted to see change. And that's why the president announced the appointment of Senator George Mitchell the second day after he took office. And that faded a bit. And then recently, he again realized through conversations with Muslim leaders, including some of our closest allies, like King Abdullah of Jordan, Mubarak of Egypt, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, that King Mohammed of Morocco, that we need to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if we are going to eliminate one major recruiting device for radicalism. Now, so they convened these parties, and they persuaded Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas to come to the table. Mahmoud Abbas came to the table on the assumption that the ban on settlement building will continue, will be extended. Now, it expired 2 nights ago. And Mahmoud Abbas today indicated that he would have few more days before he makes a decision. I think the biggest challenge facing this administration is this week. Mahmoud Abbas gave us 1 week before he pulls out if this doesn't happen. I think this is the most crucial stage in the negotiations over the years of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think if the administration cannot come up with a way to resolve this issue, I think war will not be far into the future. In fact, I think within a year or so, we will have a regional war on this issue. And the reason is that the frustration that is building there has been put aside for a while, giving Abbas an opportunity to come up with some sort of a solution. Now, there is a way out. It is not all gloom, doom and gloom. If this administration wants to use its influence, they can come up with some sort of a solution that will provide Abbas with a face-saving device and mechanism, and would provide Netanyahu with a face-saving mechanism. And that was hinted at by Mubarak 2 days ago, when Mubarak said, well, we all know that the settlement blocks, the 3 major settlement blocks in the West Bank, those will be part of Israel. That most people agree that whenever there is a settlement, even a 2-state solution, that those 3, Ma'ale Adumim and the other 2 major blocks, settlement blocks, will be part of Israel. Now, what Mubarak said, well, we might think positively about this possibility if there is a fair exchange of land, not in quantity of land, square meter for square meter, but in quality of land. Because some Israelis have suggested in the past, well, we'll give the Palestinian few more equal amount of land down in near Gaza, which is more sand and more desert. Yet that's in lieu of very fertile lands where the settlements are. What Mubarak is saying is that if there's an agreement on fair exchange of quantity and quality, then okay, we might think that's possible. Now, if this works, then Netanyahu would allow the ban to expire if construction occurs in those 3 settlements. So he would have the opportunity to continue to remove the ban on construction relating to those 3 settlements, but keep the ban on settlements outside the 3 major blocks. So that will give a face-saving device for Abbas to say, well, outside those settlements, there is a ban. So, but that has to be worked out between now and next week.